Dr. Caplan. Thank you so much for joining us from George Mason today. Super excited to talk about your New York Times bestseller on the science and ethics of immigration.
Fantastic to be here.
So in your book, you make a radical case for open borders by emphasizing how human talent can increase productivity. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on how open borders improve prospects in terms of poverty, reducing poverty, and also benefit natives and immigrants alike.
By moving to a more productive country, they're able to do a lot more. They are able to grow a lot more food. And obviously, when you grow 1,000 times more food, you don't eat it all yourself. Instead, you're going to sell it on the world market and thereby enrich the world as well as yourselves. And this is really the intuition behind the case for immigration and actually for labor mobility in general. When people move from one place to another, they are moving generally in order to get a better job, to make more money. But in the process of doing this, they are moving to do something that is more productive, because the reason why pay is higher in some places than others is because in some places labor is more productive than other places.
How would you respond to restrictionist arguments about the fiscal burden that immigrants place on the welfare state?
Another great question. So the simple answer is you've got to do math in order to answer this question. Almost no one who talks about this has any interest in doing any math at all. However, in my book, I go over very closely the National Academy of Sciences numbers as well as earlier research. And I say the main answer is that, first of all, out of immigrants that come right now, they seem to be a fiscal positive. That means that when you add up all the taxes they're ever going to pay and also estimates of what their descendants will ever pay and compare that to the cost of all the services they're going to use, and of course you want to factor in the services their descendants will use as best you can figure, turns out the immigrants that we're currently getting are a net positive, especially when you look at older and lower education groups. You can find subgroups where it is true that they do seem to actually use up more in services than they pay in taxes over their lifetime, and even when you count their descendants. But this is the exception. And when you step back a bit more, you can realize, well, gee, is there any cheaper, more humane way that we could deal with this problem if we really were worried about it? And the answer is pretty obvious, yes. How about you restrict access to benefits? So when you look at the highest immigration countries in the world, most notably the Gulf monarchies, all of them very heavily restrict access to benefits, which turns almost anyone into a big positive for the country. So I would say that insofar as you really are worried about exceptional cases of people that are a net burden, rather than say you can't come, how about say you can come if, where the if includes things like there are going to be limits on your eligibility for benefits. You have to pay a certain amount of taxes before you can collect benefits.
Some restrictionists point to the sort of brain drain argument that when you have open borders, you're sort of taking resources away from the country that you are bringing people in from. And so my question to you is that I know that in your book you sort of respond with the benefit, which is that, well, you can send remittances home. And I also know that you talked about how over time immigration doesn't necessarily happen all at once in the way that like the media might make it out to be. They sort of come over time. And so my question is, over the long term, wouldn't that mean that remittances would actually reduce? And how would that impact the prosperity and the stability of low-income countries?
Right. Well, fortunately, we actually have a few good examples of poor countries that have open borders with rich countries. So we don't just have to speculate because, yes, logically it's possible that this negative scenario would happen. The case that would be most familiar to Americans is Puerto Rico and the mainland United States. So in 1904, there was a Supreme Court case that established open borders between Puerto Rico and the U.S. And since then, over half of all people of Puerto Rican descent have ended up in the mainland U.S., and yet there's still an enormous amount of remittances going back to Puerto Rico. And more importantly, from the point of view of this brain drain argument, we can see that Puerto Rico is basically the richest island in the entire Caribbean. So while compared to the rest of the U.S., Puerto Rico is poor, it would be poorer than Mississippi. But nevertheless, compared to the likely counterfactual scenario, what would Puerto Rico be like without this open border? It seems like Puerto Rico is doing a lot better. Not just because of remittances, but also because of business connections and the opportunity to work in the U.S. and then retire later on. So there are many different channels by which opening borders winds up being good for the sending countries as well as the receiving countries. Another big gain that you get from immigration is the people that are innovative, people with new ideas about how to farm or new ideas about seeds or anything else. As long as they stay trapped in relatively primitive agricultural economies, the odds they will ever get to put those ideas in practice are pretty low. Whereas if they are allowed to go and move to higher tech countries, they're much more likely to be able to try their ideas out, to actually get them adopted. And then, here is the really cool part, those ideas, once adopted in richer countries, often will flow back to poorer countries, because once they've been tried out, once you've got a new seed, say, then it is a prime opportunity to say, hey, let's go and export these genetically modified seeds back to, say, Pakistan, thereby allowing agriculture for the remaining workers of Pakistan to also go up. So this is one of the really great things about ideas. A new idea anywhere can become a great idea everywhere, but it is nevertheless true that normally there are centers of innovation, and if you want to innovate, you need to get there.
Well, it was lovely talking to you. Thank you so much for your time, and this was a very insightful conversation.